1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2.
Hello and welcome to the Commonwealth Magazine Codcast in partnership with TransitMatters. I'm your host, Josh Fairchild. I'm a board member at TransitMatters.
I'm your co-host, Jim Aloisi, also a board member with TransitMatters.
Today we're joined by Tony Dutzik. He's a senior policy analyst with the Frontier Group. So I guess, Tony, first if you could give us just a little bit of background of what the Frontier Group is, and then today we want to talk about the recent report, so you could begin talking about that even too.
Sure, great. It's great to be here. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Jim. So Frontier Group is a nonprofit public policy organization. Our mission is to provide information and ideas to help Americans build a healthier, more democratic, and cleaner society. I work here in Boston, but we're a national organization, and much of our work is done in coordination with nonprofit organizations and other partners on a variety of issues. My area of interest is mostly on issues related to transportation, energy, and the climate.
Thanks, Tony. Now, did you know, let me just begin. I want you to know we're going to be talking about transit and tax policy today. We've got with us not just two transit geeks, but you've got two tax lawyers. People may not know that before I was involved in transportation, I was chief legal counsel at the Revenue Department. So we won't bore people with tax law, but the conversation is going to discuss the intersection of tax policy and sustainable mobility.
Yes, and that's a typical trajectory for folks to move from tax law into transportation advocacy and expertise.
So tell us about you, Frontier Group, I think working with Transit Center, and I believe Josh actually was helping you on this a little bit, issued a report recently. Tell us about that report and why it's important for people who are listening to this podcast to understand its implications.
Sure. So the report was called Who Pays for Parking? And it's actually the second report that we've done along with Transit Center looking at federal tax policy with relation to commuter tax benefits. So essentially, the long and the short of it is that the federal government, when you pay your income taxes, you pay your income taxes on your income and also on some fringe benefits that you receive. However, when it comes to parking that is provided to you by your employer, either that they provide in a lot that they lease or that is on their site, or that they provide for you via a voucher, you can receive that income tax-free. That's a thing of value, and it's especially a thing of value in a city like Boston, where parking prices can be rather high, and you can receive that up until the equivalent of about $255 a month. The consequence of that, though, is that when you're not paying taxes on that income, that is in essence a subsidy that encourages people to drive to workplaces in cities like Boston, where they tend to be congested. And in fact, when we subsidize people to drive to work, we do that. Oftentimes the result of that is that we're subsidizing them to drive in precisely the places and at precisely the times that experience the most congestion. And all of us dislike congestion on the roads. Mm-hmm. So the sum total of that policy, which we estimated in a report 3 years ago called Subsidizing Congestion, was that the federal government and state governments essentially lose about $7.3 billion of revenue each year due to this tax break. And at the same time, we're putting about 820,000 more cars on the road every morning and every evening because we exempt the value of that commuter parking from taxation, from income taxes and from state taxes and payroll taxes. So the reason that people need to be concerned about this is because when we think about, in a city like Boston or in many of our cities, when we think about the problems that get the most ink and that draw the most concern from people in our transportation networks, the thing that people inevitably come back to is congestion. The number of folks who are stuck on I-93 coming into the city, or who are trying to just do the things that they want to do in their daily lives. And here we have a policy which is not only putting more cars on the road at precisely the times that we don't want them, but is actually spending our tax money to do it. So what is important, I think, for folks to understand is that there are many policies like this that operate in the background at the federal level and at the state level that make it harder for our cities to provide good transportation options, to address the kinds of challenges that we see on our streets and on our roads every single day, and that tend to get very little scrutiny and very little attention. So this is just one of those policies that operates in the background, perhaps provides a subsidy that many people don't even know that they get, but that actually has a really significant impact on how we get around in our cities.
I think it'll be important for some people to try to figure out how we got here in tax policy. And one of the reasons this happens is because the age-old issue of litigation with the IRS is what is income? That's the ultimate question. And there was a point where the IRS was beginning to say, oh, all these people are getting income in the form of parking, and they started to make overtures that they were going to begin taxing that parking as a form of salary, basically a like-kind salary almost. And Congress didn't like that.
No, they didn't like it at all. So in the 1970s, actually, and it wasn't just parking, but a series of other fringe benefits that the IRS, and looking around the country, saw that employees were getting more of their compensation in the form of these fringe benefits that weren't being taxed. And so the IRS began to look at opportunities to start incorporating those fringe benefits as taxable income. And commuter parking, as you said, was one of those things that they looked at. Congress reacted to that in a pretty negative way. They imposed a series of moratoria in the late 70s and early 80s that prevented the IRS from going further down that route. And then in the early 1980s, they created really the beginnings of the policy that we have today, where it was codified into federal law that there was this qualified transportation fringe benefit that was exempt from calculations of taxable income, and then employers could provide that to their employees.
It has to be provided by the employer.
Correct.
So the way this works, and correct me if I'm wrong, so people really understand, a lawyer making $400,000 a year parking under International Place basically doesn't pay for a parking spot that probably costs on the market $35 a day. Doesn't pay for that. And there's a commuter tax benefit where that lawyer making $400,000 a year is basically getting that tax exemption. And Americans, all of us who pay taxes, are subsidizing that to the tune of nearly $8 billion a year.
That's right. And it pops up in a couple of different contexts. So that's the most extreme example.
It's a way to show, because I think there's a social equity component to this as well.
Yeah, there very much is. So if you look at who receives the benefits and who benefits the most from the policy, the folks who receive the most value from this are folks who are parking in downtown areas where parking is very expensive. One of the things that I think is actually not really well understood by the public, to the extent that this gets talked about at all, is that when you talk about most of the transportation policies and subsidies that we have that encourage automobile dependence, tend to subsidize suburban, either trips from the suburbs into the city or transportation infrastructure in suburban areas. But if you work in an office park out by 495, you're basically not receiving any of this subsidy because the parking that is provided to you is so abundant that it's essentially worthless. Now, that's another problem that we could talk about in a different podcast. But in this case, what is really driving the amount of subsidy that you receive is the value of the parking you receive. The second thing that drives it is what your tax bracket is, so what your marginal tax rate is. So again, if you're a lawyer making $400,000 a year, you're going to be getting a greater amount of dollar benefit from this tax break than the secretary making $40,000 a year, even if you receive parking in exactly the same way.
Because if you're in the highest tax bracket, you're getting the tax benefit is almost 40 cents per dollar of that benefit to you.
Correct.
I think one of the other things that can be confusing about these fringe benefits is that most people, a lot of people, their employers may not necessarily pay for the benefit, but they will allow the employee to set aside that portion of their income on a monthly basis to pay for the parking. Or many people are more familiar maybe with getting a transit pass, and you're basically taking a portion of your income, putting it into that account for the transit pass. It's no longer counted as your income up to the limit of $255 a month at the federal level. Same thing on the parking side. So whether the employer gives you extra money to pay for that or the employer allows you to set aside the money you have, that's a fringe benefit that only a certain class of employers allows to their employees. So there's an implication that it's a certain you have to have a certain level of income already to be in sort of the pot of employers that provide these kind of fringe benefits to qualify. And then when you get to that point, it's the people in the upper tax brackets that are getting the most benefit from it.
Right, and I think the other thing about the parking subsidy that is often misunderstood is that even when we talk about the lawyer in International Place, if you drive into that facility, there's probably a fare gate, and there's if you're a member of the general public, you might pay to park there. The benefit comes to you even if that's not the case. Even if you're parking in a free facility that is owned by your employer or rented by your employer or leased, but if it is in a place where parking would otherwise have value. So if if that lawyer, for example, is parking in a leased parking space and a lot out back, and you wouldn't do this in International Place, but you might do this somewhere else in the city of Boston, then they're also receiving, even if there's not a dollar that changes hands between the employee, the employer, and the parking facility on a day-to-day basis, you're still receiving a tax benefit from that.
And we don't have to necessarily go too far down the rabbit hole on the more suburban locations, but basically, where the parking is more abundant, it's because city codes have required more parking to be built, which means less building can be built, which means the rents are higher to compensate for the land that does not have offices or retail on it. So your rent in that case includes the parking, which is paid for by the employer, and the employer does not necessarily put that on their in there. They don't actually account for that as an expenditure, the parking necessarily. They just are accounting for rent.
Right, and even where they do account for it as an expenditure, what the IRS uses to determine the value of the parking is based on its market value. So how much would you have to pay as a member of the general public if you were going to pay there, or what is the equivalent of that that's being provided for free? And if you have acres and acres of parking around in a suburban office park campus, then that doesn't have a market value. So another question here is how do we value parking? How do we value the benefits that people are receiving? But from the IRS's methodology, it's all based on fair market value. And even if the employer is paying something for it, if you as a consumer could go and get it for free somewhere else, which in most of these places you can, it's not going to be taxed.
So in Boston, we have a EPA-imposed cap on the number of parking spots in downtown Boston. So how does this policy affect? I mean, obviously, we're not increasing the number of spots because the demand is going up. There's only so many spots to go around. How does this affect Boston in that case?
Well, I think it affects Boston in the sense that again, the impact of the policy is beyond simply downtown Boston, but there are many other places in and around the urban core where parking does have value and where there is a tax benefit that accrues to that. The other thing that it may be doing is to also help drive up the cost of parking, because if you're receiving, the benefit, it increases the demand. The last thing that I would just say is that, and we raised this issue in the report, but we really don't have, one of the things that I think is really challenging about this is that there is so little data and so little analysis that has been done on the implications of these benefits. But one of the questions that we raised in the report is, does the $255 a month cap, is that actually a real thing that is enforced by the IRS? And to the extent that you're receiving parking in a voucher from your employer, then your employer is not going to go and give you something that is, because if it's above $255 a month, you're supposed to pay taxes on the value of the parking that is in excess of $255 a month. And we had a devil of a time figuring out whether there is any enforcement of that limit for circumstances where the employer is actually paying for the parking.
I'm going to give you a guess.
Pocket.
Very little is happening. So what we know is that there's federal tax policy that goes back to the 1970s that bears no relationship to the 21st century, but that encourages really bad mobility behavior and is inherently socially inequitable. We also know that federal law has a similar but unequal treatment for transit users. Let's talk about that a little bit and how the federal law is actually antagonistic to itself.
Sure. So starting in pretty much about as soon as the federal government created and codified the parking benefit, there began to be very legitimate complaints from people who were taking public transportation to work that this was inequitable. So if I am a public transportation user and I'm using $70 of my own income that I've paid taxes on already to buy a transit pass, and yet my neighbor at the next cubicle is getting $70 worth of parking tax-free, that's not exactly fair. So what the federal government did in the early 1990s was to create a parallel transit benefit that is similar to the parking benefit. So the value of that has gone up and down over time, but currently it is capped out at the same $255 a month at the federal level, and there's state tax issues that we can talk about some other time. But it essentially enables you to receive a transit pass or to set aside money for a transit pass or transit services tax-free in the same way that the parking benefit does. The problem with the transit benefit is that it doesn't reach nearly as many people as the parking benefit does on a national basis. As you mentioned, Josh, it's historically been the case that the kinds of employers that offer the transit benefit tend to be larger employers. They tend to be employers that not only have more employees, but also tend to have better off employees, so they can offer this as a benefit as a way to be competitive with other companies that are looking to hire the same people. And so in our report from 2014, we estimated that the number of people who receive the transit benefit is just vastly lower than the number of people who receive the parking benefit, and it's as a result of that the net effect of both of these policies combined is to put more cars on the road.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the states have the option of adopting laws that would have at least some transit parity with vehicles, and also provide a smaller tax benefit for cyclists. And we haven't done that in Massachusetts. And I just heard this morning the bill, which has been filed for the past 3 years, continues to be stuck in the House Ways and Means Committee.
That's right. So most states follow federal definitions of income. And in states that do that, it's relatively easy to take changes that are made in the tax benefits at the federal level and impose them, make them the same at the state level. Massachusetts doesn't do that in this particular case. So a few years ago, the federal government created permanent parity between parking benefits and transit benefits at now $255 a month, but it had previously been the case that the top transit benefit was significantly lower, and I forget the number now. It's in the 100s, yes. But the state of Massachusetts has not yet made that leap to full parity for your state taxes. And the other thing that, as I understand it, Massachusetts hasn't done is it hasn't implemented a small bicycling commuting benefit that was adopted at the federal level a number of years ago and hasn't yet made its way to Massachusetts for state tax purposes. So, it's beyond. So, in one sense, it's inequitable. In another sense, it's also just incredibly confusing that you have, the same behaviors are being treated differently in relation to your income at the federal and state level.
Well, it's been a matter of some frustration. TransitMatters, T4Mass, others, for the past several years have been advocating for and promoting legislation that would provide that parity for Massachusetts transit users and also cyclists. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, we just cannot get the legislature to adopt the legislation to make this happen. So it's currently stuck in House Ways and Means. If you're listening and you care about this issue, that's where it is. But it goes to my earlier point. There is an embedded social inequity in the commuter tax benefit for people who drive. And so if we're going to have a socially equitable, sustainable mobility system, at the very least, we can think about creating these kinds of parities and offer people who decide to use lower carbon modes the opportunity to benefit as well.
Right. Now, I think that's true. And the other thing that a number of cities around the country have done is, in recognition of this fact that the number of people who have access to the transit benefit is lower generally than those who have access to the parking benefit, and that the people who tend not to have access to the transit benefit are the people who are precisely those who need it the most.
Yes.
So folks who are lower income, middle income people may be working in places where transit services a little more challenging. What some cities and the Bay Area and California have done is to pass ordinances requiring employers above a certain number of employees to actually offer transit benefits to their workers as a way both to kind of counteract the negative impacts of the parking benefit and to expand people's access to and incentives to use low-carbon, sustainable modes of transportation.
I will say the one way that Massachusetts is a little bit progressive on this front is that they do offer an after-tax deduction for transit benefit, which basically means that if your employer doesn't provide the fringe benefit, you can still deduct a certain amount from your income after the fact on your tax return. Unfortunately, it doesn't allow you to deduct the full value of the transit pass. It only gives you something like 75% of it if you look at the whole year of expenditure. And it does not give you enough to really cover like the commuter train, the commuter rail. So it's nowhere near equitable with the benefits we offer to employees who get fringe benefits from their employers, but it is a start. But I think the big lesson here is that we're basically paying on both sides, and even at the state level, we're sort of like fighting to get parity for something that still amounts to us paying on both sides to try to encourage people to both drive and use transit. What are some of the things that you've seen and you've written about in your report about how we can reform the system starting at the federal level?
Sure. Well, at the federal level, the two things that we really looked at were, first of all, how do you fix the parking benefit and the parking subsidy? And the answer to that is actually a lot more, as a couple of tax lawyers would understand, that the answer to that is actually a lot more complicated than meets the eye, because what you then have to do is you have to create a system by which employers can actually calculate and understand the value of the parking that they're providing to their employees. That's not necessarily an easy or a straightforward thing to do, and the IRS guidance on it is not particularly helpful. What we've seen in looking at other countries around the world and how they deal with this problem is that there are a number of models that countries like Australia have used that create just a standardized formula for how employers can make that calculation so that they actually can report it as income. And in a number of other countries, Austria is one of these, Ireland, there are a couple of others, there's just simply a requirement that if you offer parking in an urban area, and they define urban areas in different ways, that you then have to account for that in taxable income or pay a surtax in order to compensate for that benefit that you've received. So it's a challenging thing. I think it's challenging politically, but it's also challenging just in terms of implementation to fix the parking benefit. But there are some models from around the world of how people have done that. The other part of the equation is to fix the transit benefit. And the transit benefit, has this fundamental problem of not enough people getting it. And cities have begun to take some action on that. But there's also a bigger issue there, which is that benefit is fundamentally inaccessible for people who are contractors, for people who work in the gig economy, or for people who are self-employed. And, as we all know, those are the kind of employment arrangements that are becoming much more common every day. So I think, Josh, to your point about the Massachusetts tax break for the T, finding a way for those people who can't necessarily take advantage of the transit benefit through their employer to find a way for them to access it as a deduction or in some other way through the federal tax code is one way to address that problem. The second problem is that the transit benefit was created more than 20 years ago. And you and I, we all know that transportation has changed a lot in the last 20 years. We have a variety of new transportation services out now that didn't exist then, and prospect of more of that to come. So we suggest in the report that we give a strong look at the federal level to rethinking which of those services should actually be eligible for tax-free treatment. One really good example of that is bike sharing. So, for a lot of folks in the Boston area and elsewhere, bike sharing is an essential first and last mile connection to transit, and it's a transit mode in and of itself. But under federal law, bike sharing counts neither toward the transit benefit, nor does it count toward the bicycling benefit that you mentioned, Jim. So finding a way to sort out the transit benefit so that it meets the 21st century opportunities that we have is another really important thing to do at the federal level. I would just note that, personally, I'm not that optimistic that we are going to fix the parking the parking benefit anytime soon. But I do think that one of the reasons why it's important that we did this report, and one of the reasons that I'm grateful that you've had us on today to talk about it, is because to the extent that we are aware of some of these hidden subsidies that exist in the tax code and elsewhere for driving, the more that it incentivizes legislators, cities, folks at the state level to begin to think about how we can come up with creative ways to undo some of the harm that they create.
And I think that's what we've been trying to get, we, advocates and others, this legislature to do, to sort of pay attention to this issue. If you think about this, if large companies, banks, financial institutions, law firms, are buying up, basically what they're doing is they're buying up chunks of expensive parking underground in many of the places in Boston, right? And offering them basically as a part of the compensation for their employees. They're driving the price to the average person up because there's fewer parking spaces in that garage. So there is a synergy, and it's in the benefit of the owner of that in terms of revenue to have this in place because it drives up their prices, right? It's a supply and demand issue. You talk about Australia. Are there other best practices globally that we can learn from?
Well, one of the other best practices that we talked about in the report is actually something that can occur at the city level. One of the messages of this report is that to the extent that the federal benefits won't really be addressed anytime soon, that it's really incumbent on cities to find creative solutions. So there are a number of cities, the example that we cite in the report is in Nottingham, England, that have created parking levies that essentially recapture some of the tax revenue that is lost to the public through the federal tax benefit, and instead recapture some of that tax revenue and invest it in transportation options locally. So in Nottingham, what they've done is that they have taxed for employers who offer a certain number of parking spaces. There's an annual fee that's assessed on those parking spaces, and then that fee, the revenue from that fee, is reinvested in public transportation and in other kinds of transportation options. So they have managed to help expand their tram system, to provide transportation benefits to employees, and to do all sorts of things that have enabled them to do what I think people in Boston and people in other parts of the Commonwealth want to do, which is to grow the number of people, businesses, and prosperity in our urban centers, and to do it without increasing congestion. That's really the holy grail here, and I think there are examples from both around the United States and around the world of cities that have taken proactive approaches to doing that.
Of course, here the legislature would again have to act to empower municipalities to have the ability to do that. Recent report issued by the State Senate and the Bar Foundation, which surveyed people around the state, suggested there was very high incidence of support for having the legislature do that, to enact a law that would delegate or empower cities and towns to impose their own fees or taxes for specific transportation needs. And some of us, myself in particular, have been talking about potentially imposing a carbon fee on non-residential parking that you would then dedicate to transit. So that's exactly
right.
the
Very
kind of
similar
fix that we'd be talking about.
That's right.
By the way, so people know, if they want to read your report, just give them what's the site that they go to? How can they read and download this report?
Sure. You can go to www.frontiergroup.org, and there you can find both this report, which again is called Who Pays for Parking, as well as a number of other reports that we've done over the years on various aspects of transportation policy that have a lot of relevance, we think, to life in Boston and in the Commonwealth more broadly. So, we're always encourage folks to go and make use of the content and the research that we've produced.
I would just give one final thought to people who are diving into this world of tax policy thinking, would just be that with tax reform being something that's being discussed, whether or not it happens, it does seem that one of the things that is agreed to is that there's going to be some reduction in the tax rates. And one thing that we constantly find is whenever we talk about reforming the tax code, we're talking about all these, people might call them loopholes, all these ways that you can exclude income, basically, or call it tax expenditure on the federal government side. So these tax deductions are worth a lot to people. But if tax rates go down, then they're worth less because you're getting less from the deduction. If things like the standard deduction that people get goes up, then you may not even use some of these. So if there is some very simple forms of tax reform, or even if we get lower rates, which people may be opposed to or not, it does potentially open the door to playing with some of these loopholes or tax deductions that are causing a lot of problems that have to be overcome at the local level.
Yeah, I agree with that to a degree. Certainly with rates, that changes the economic benefits of the various choices that people make. However, one of the things that is devilishly difficult about the parking benefit is that it's not a deduction. In fact, it's an exclusion of income at the very beginning of the whole taxation process. So not only does that mean that it's more difficult to root out in tax reform, but it's also something that makes it very difficult even to understand the degree to which people benefit from it. So, one of the recommendations that we've made in the report is that it really, when Congress began down this road in the 1970s, they did not begin to think about the implications of this tax change on transportation policy and on transportation in our cities. We looked at the congressional record. We could find no evidence that it was ever even discussed when these policies were initially being considered. Now, 40 years down the road, we have a better understanding of what the implications are, and it's time for us to really do the kind of deep study of their impacts on transportation that we should have done when we made these policies in the first place. So I think it's really important that we have better data, and it's also really important that organizations like ours, but also ideally the federal government, really do the kind of work that is needed to understand the implications and the impacts on our transportation system.
Well, knowledge is power, and I hope that this conversation for listeners gives them a little more understanding of this particularly arcane aspect of the tax law. And I hope, frankly, the people who use transit and who cycle will consider how they're being shortchanged in Massachusetts and act on that if they so choose to take advantage of what is available to them.
Yes, indeed. That's very true. And for all of those of you who have managed to sit through this conversation about tax law and transportation, definitely encourage you to look at the full report, which has a lot of interesting data and a lot of interesting examples from around the world of places that have begun to take on this challenge.
Well, Tony, thank you for joining us. And
Thank
to the
you.
listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Codcast.
Catch you later.
Wonderful.